Mic check, volume check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, level looks a little bit loud, but I think I'm almost ready to start. So I'm gonna reposition my stuff here around my desk, and then I'll get going. Alrighty, that's better. My books are in front of me now. So I am currently, 2 books just arrived for me from Amazon. I'm actually really excited to start reading these books. It's been about a topic that I've been thinking about for at least a little while. And the concepts, of course, are the difference between the Keynesian and the Austrian schools of economics. So I've been reading a lot about current economic policy in the US. I've actually linked a lot of different things that are very relevant on my website, foobarbat.me, and kind of been trying to understand what the heck's going on right now in the US with the Federal Reserve, with the money printing, the recession indicators and all that. My search for answers has ultimately led me here, to these 2 books. So the one book that any economics nerd will tell you, like, you gotta read is the John Maynard Keynes' The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. This is a landmark text. John Maynard Keynes is a incredibly intelligent individual, and he became one of the foremost premier influential economists after the Great Depression. He argued a bunch of different things, but some of his most important arguments kind of came into what is the role of the private versus the public sector. Will the private sector, given free reign, have booms and busts that are destructive and not self-correcting unless acted on by an outside force? And what role should the government play in influencing money, monetary policy, and stimulative or restrictive, hawkish or dovish, in other words, stances? And this is a everybody will tell you, you got to read this. It is probably the architect of how many economists over the past 50, 60, 70 years have viewed their field. They view it through the Keynesian lens because, in his generation and the generation immediately afterwards, this was an incredibly important text for them understanding the economic crisis that they were going through. At least that's how I view it. I view it through that lens. I am not incredibly well read on this topic, so I would love to be corrected on my conception of Keynesian economics, but kind of my inkling of it that I've got going into it is that the failures of the Great Depression really made a lot of people consider what went wrong. And this was one answer. This answer was that no government involvement and just regular business cycles could be very destructive if not managed very well and governed with, like, interest rates and monetary policy, etc. So this is the foundation upon which I think one of the 2 primary mandates of the Federal Reserve is based. The maximum employment mandate, I believe, is sourced from ideas and arguments presented in this text. And that has historically been a driver for large amounts of economic policy and economic thinking is through the Keynesian lens. Now, the reason that I keep bringing up the word Keynesian is because of John Maynard Keynes. Nobody is arguing that he's an incredibly bright individual. What I'm trying to find out is, were his ideas a product and a consequence of the times he lived in and his generation, and for his generation and the generation immediately following, were these ideas in coping with the Great Depression so important that they may have been unfairly restricted the diversity of thought within this field for this type of economics. So I'm very excited I got these books in the mail. I'm most particularly excited for this book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, given how much I've heard of it. But I'm also really excited to, after reading each chapter in this book, I'm actually going to be going through, and I don't know much about this author, so please forgive me if this is like some kind of Republican, like, crazy crap. But there's actually a fair amount of criticism of the Keynesian school of thought, and probably one of the most diametrically opposed schools of thought is called the Austrian school of economics. And I don't know nearly enough about it to be able to like dive into detail about what it means. But the Austrian school, in a elevator pitch, you could say that while Keynes viewed the business cycle and everything that led up to the Great Depression as a consequence and an unavoidable facet of completely unmanaged economies, he argued for very aggressive management of economies in the business cycle. Henry Hazlitt and the Austrian school have a very different view. They believe that the causes of the Great Depression were very reproducible and studyable. They believed that the Great Depression was caused by some very unique circumstances, and that economies will eventually be able to self-manage and get through these kind of cycles. And so, it's a completely diametric school of thought. I think this is very interesting to me because whenever you see two groups that have such completely different ways of viewing something, I like to try to understand at least a little bit about both of those groups, because that means that it's interesting. If people have such strong opinions about it, to me that signals that it's interesting in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to be very interested in reading through this book, John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And then what's very unique about Henry Hazlitt's critique of that text is that this is like a line-by-line refutation of the entire text. And that just shows you how influential the Keynesian thought is, that somebody would bother to go through every chapter and analyze and nitpick at every little bit. It would be like if somebody like went through the entire Bible and said, oh, this wasn't translated properly, this isn't what that means, this part's incorrect, like page by page, like for the entire Bible is basically the equivalent of what this book is. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification. Particularly something that I've been really interested in from the very brief amount of time that I've skimmed this book, is it mentions some stuff about maximum employment that answered some questions that I had about understanding current economic situations, particularly in the US. Looking at, let me bring up my monitor real quick. I'm going to go into the huge discrepancy between the name is on the tip of my tongue, but specifically monetary policy in the United States, the Federal Reserve's goal of maximum employment, and the potential disconnect between what monetary policy should be based on very provable mathematical concepts and what it has actually been over the past maybe like 10, 15 years, and whether or not that could be dangerous for the path of the economic cycle. And so I'm going to start getting into that, but first we're going to look at some charts. Okay, let me bring up my screen capture. Let's see, I think it is, where is it? Okay, so this is the huge chart for me. Okay, it is the Taylor rule. I wasn't just making that up from some math class I took a while back. So it's known as the Taylor rule prescription. And this is a, we can look this up on Wikipedia even. And so it's a targeting monetary policy used by central banks. So the interbank lending rate, I think that might be the right name for it, for the Federal Reserve, is basically, it influences the availability of capital throughout the entire economy. If you go to a bank that you interact with, maybe have an account with, behind the scenes, a lot of what they do actually directly links into kind of more consolidated systems, until kind of the core of that system, the beating heart of that system, is the Federal Reserve. So you'll hear a lot of news a lot of the time talking about the Federal Reserve interest rate. Particularly recently, you may have heard about the interest rate being pegged to like near zero, and how the Federal Reserve is making commitments to keep it near zero for a very long period due to their concerns about the current economy. And so what I find interesting about this is there's a lot of pretty good evidence that math-based policy such as the Taylor rule is like definitely the way to do it. There's a lot of good evidence that either stimulating or restricting the pace and the money supply of the economy is very well governed algorithmically by the Taylor rule. And so it has to do with a lot of different factors. And basically the efficacy of the Taylor rule was actually a very interesting point of evidence against some of the Keynesian economic thought, such to the point where even some of the most diehard Keynesian scholars started to acknowledge the Taylor rule and its efficacy. Let's see. So the Taylor rule is supposed to govern the monetary policy. It is supposed to determine, how loose or tight fiscal measures will be to kind of manage the economic cycle, and to manage and make sure there's no like boom and bust and like crazy swings. It's designed to be kind of like a guide rail. Let's say it's supposed to be a guide rail upon which the actual Federal Reserve will fluctuate. And if we actually go to the Federal Reserve site, I find it kind of ironic. Ooh, this site no longer has data. I want to see this. They used to have a chart. Okay, yeah, they do have a chart. Okay, so if I can... So if we look at this purple line here, this is the actual Federal Reserve fund rate. And I have on my thing, not here, but here. Okay, so this is the Federal Reserve fund rate, and if we go all the way back and look at, all of United States history, it's been all over the place. During the inflationary periods, we had some very interesting things happening to it in like the 70s. And lately, the strange thing has happened where we had the dot-com bubble burst, and so you see that drop, and then we had the housing bubble burst. But what has been really interesting is that these rates have stayed almost near zero well into the previous decade. And even in 2019, when they started to try to ratchet it up, they had to go back down again very quickly, which is very interesting. And I think this might be a telltale indicator for the economy. And part of why I'm examining the Taylor rule is because of the large disconnect between the Taylor rule kind of guide rails and what the actual Federal Reserve fund rates have been. Some people argue, such as I don't want to misquote him, but Ray Dalio, in his pretty interesting book, Navigating Big Debt Crises, which he wrote after the 2008 bubble, has this really interesting page in here, and he says, this is one of the biggest problems with most central bank policies, i.e., because central bankers target either inflation or inflation and growth and don't target the management of bubbles, the debt growth that they enable can go to finance the creation of bubbles if inflation and real growth don't appear to be too strong. In my opinion, it's very important for central banks to target debt growth with an eye towards keeping it at a sustainable level, i.e., a level where the growth in income is likely to be large enough to service the debts regardless of what credit is used to buy. Central bankers sometimes say that it is too hard to spot bubbles and that it's not their role to assess and control them, that it is their job to control inflation and growth. But what they control is money and credit. And when that money and credit goes into debts that can't be paid back, that has huge implications for the growth and inflation down the road. The greatest depressions occur when bubbles burst, and if central banks that are producing the debts that are inflating them won't control them, then who will? The economic pain of allowing a large bubble to inflate and then burst is so high that it is imprudent for policymakers to ignore them, and I hope their perspective will change. So this paragraph really struck me. I really like Dalio's Navigating Big Debt Crises. For like the 5 or so chapters I've been able to get through it. It's pretty dense, but it is a very well-written book. And kind of one of the core ideas he talks about in the intro pages is he says, like, the economy is like a bunch of people playing Monopoly. At the beginning of the cycle, people really like debt and credit for the multiplicative effect that it has for allowing economies to grow, for new projects to be started, for things to be financed. And so he says it's like this big, fierce competitive game that just gets more and more high stakes until everybody's leveraged out the wazoo. And then eventually, at the end of that debt cycle, things need to be like scaled back, debts need to be restructured. There are a bunch of different ways to do that, and there are different thoughts on what's the best way to do that. But that's typically like considered like an economic contraction when that occurs. And it's, in his view, it is kind of a healthy aspect of an economy for regulating it. But you want to be sure that this is happening in a sane way, that the debt is being issued in a sane way to prevent the creation of these giant bubbles and stuff like that. So what was I going to say? Yeah, so he says, typically debt crises occur because debt and debt service costs rise faster than the incomes that are needed to service them, causing a deleveraging. So again, in this game of Monopoly where, people are taking out loans and mortgages and buying up Park Place and Boardwalk, this cycle gets into increasing and increasing usage of debt. What he's arguing is that a problem occurs when firms or individuals or the entire economy have so much debt that their ability to produce income and service these debts is seriously threatened. So it's concerning when a large portion of debt is unserviceable by normal income, because that means that they're very underwater, and it can cause structural issues for the economy. Um, so that's what he means by deleveraging, is like people either paying off debt, restructuring debt, or defaulting on debt. And then when he says the central bank can alleviate typical debt crises by lowering real and nominal interest rates, severe debt crises, i.e. depressions, occur when this is no longer possible. I find that really interesting, and I kind of want to go back and see if I can see on the federal funds rate what it looked like in the 1920s. So we don't have data going back that far. But that was a huge debt restructuring for the Great Depression. There was a lot of leverage in the economy preceding it. And it could probably be viewed through this debt crisis lens. So what was I going to say? Okay, so the effective federal funds rate, if we look over the preceding, score years, 20 years, or even a little bit farther out, we can see that the Federal Reserve funds rates are extremely low historically. And, this period of maybe the past 20, 30 years is a complete anomaly to what we've seen in the past. And especially this decade, where things have been, near the floor for so long, even though we've had a booming economy, that I find that interesting. And I want to understand that better. Which is why this discrepancy between the actual federal funds rate and the Taylor rule is interesting to me. I wonder if the guide rails have kind of been breached, if the train has gotten off the tracks, and I wonder what the effects of that would be. One school of thought is by allowing the Federal Reserve rate to be depressed for so long, either due to politics or fear from the previous two recessions, or from blowhard idiots wanting to keep the economy roaring regardless of the effects later. I wonder if that rate has been too low for too long, and I wonder what the effects of that have been on lending, the glut of debt, and whether or not that could have long-term implications. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm getting into this. We can see that they had other things here previously on this chart. But if you look at it from kind of a more minute detail using parameters that are much more correct, it's pretty concerning that this guide rail has been jumped so far after being pretty closely adhered to over most of history, most of modern history anyways. So that's kind of what has led me to trying to understand Keynesian economics. I think that the aggressive targeting of full employment, while noble and virtuous in intent, might have long-term implications that have been underconsidered. So I'm not trying to sound like a crackpot, but it is interesting to think from a long-term historical perspective, what value systems and philosophies have led into leading us to where we are now, to where the interest rate's at zero, and I think I read over a quarter of all dollars ever printed were printed in the past 12 months, and I think it might be more than that now. I want to understand what has led us here. I want to understand, why debt has increased so much throughout the entire economy. I want to understand why interest rates have hit the floor and they've ran out of stuff to do, so they're printing money. I want to better understand these. And I think the lens which I'm trying to understand them is trying to understand why we jump these guide rails, and what the effects of that could be, and what those guide rails are for anyways. Why has the Taylor rule guided economic policy for most of this history, but it hasn't for the past 10 years, and what could the effects of that be? Oh yeah, one more interesting chart. So if you were of the theory, which this is not a proven theory, this is not financial advice, but historical indicators that people may have used to kind of look at market valuations could have been the ratio of market cap in terms of the valuation of equities of parts of businesses and what they actually produce, the GDP, the gross domestic product. If you are of the opinion that the guide rails have been jumped for maybe the past 10 years, and policy has been too stimulative and kind of formative of a bubble, an interesting chart to look at might be the Buffett indicator of the total market cap versus the gross domestic product of what the United States, so what the United States cumulatively their businesses are valued at versus what they produce. And I think it's very interesting that there's been a lot of new debt issued during this 10-year period, and that valuations have skyrocketed. As some people have put it, interest rates are gravity. So if you lower the interest rate, you lower gravity. And these valuations are very high compared to historical expectations. So it's 194.4%. And so I'm trying to understand, why are valuations so high? And could that have been influenced by interest rates and our jumping of the guide rails these past 10 years? So what was I going to get into? Okay, so we talked about the Taylor rule, talked about the Buffett indicator, and trying to understand businesses' production, and how debt and the interest rate might influence these. I think the best place for me to go into now might be to talk about the Federal Reserve, and what their goals are. So there's a really kind of funny video made by this guy's an economist and a country singer. He goes by the stage name Merle Hazard. And he does a very good job of explaining the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve. And you can read about it just about anywhere, but I want to see if I can. Okay, the Chicago Fed. This is so the Federal Open Market Committee announced substantial revisions to its policy framework in its updated statement on longer run goals and monetary policy. So they actually changed their strategy recently, which I think is very newsworthy, and it's very interesting for why they changed it. I was a fan of the changes they made, but I'm getting off topic here. So their mandate is the management of stable prices, and maximum employment. So they have a dual mandate. It's almost like a twin-headed snake. Interestingly, the ECB, the European Central Bank, only has the mandate of stable prices. So for the ECB, their goal is to make sure that, if it costs $5 or €5, sorry, for beer one day, that maybe like, 10 years from then, it should, be stable price, like $5 plus, maybe 2% inflation per year or something like that. So that's their goal, is to maintain stable prices. For the Federal Reserve, they have the dual mandate of, yes, stable prices, but they also, due to Keynesian economic thought, they have the goal of maximum employment, which there might be some political background behind that, of maximum employment being very desirable from both a, public, I don't want to use the word welfare because that has connotations, but public, like health, if a large swath of the public is not employed, like after the Great Depression, and things are getting kind of roaring downhill as like production ramps down, people have less stuff to buy things, and then production keeps ramping down even further, kind of in a self-reinforcing cycle. That's undesirable. And the argument for the Keynesians is that maximum employment is the goal that you want to try to reach, and do monetary policy to reach that. So the Federal Reserve, based on that philosophy, has the dual mandate of stable prices and maximum employment. And so what this means is that, so like say over the previous 10 years, we reached full employment maybe in like 2018, 2019. But the interesting thing to consider is that during that period, the definition of maximum employment was actually moved to be more inclusive of the entire population, and to making sure that, all the different subgroups of the population were also achieving the same milestones that were expected of the broader population. I think that that's a very good idea. I wonder what, still regardless of that, and maybe considering that, mostly regardless of that, has monetary policy jumped that guardrail that is meant to like keep bubbles in check? That's the primary focus of concern. I think unpacking the Federal Reserve's dual mandate is very interesting, especially considering that they've been considering that themselves. They've been heavily considering what they're doing and their operating strategy themselves. So that's kind of news that may have completely flown under the radar the past 12 months for most people. But I think it's very important, and I think it's very interesting. So I've talked about the Federal Reserve's dual mandate and how that may have influenced monetary policy. Oh yeah, Keynesian stuff. Okay, so let's go back into the core topic of this. Keynesian versus Austrian School of Economics. Let me see if I can find a good summary somewhere. So I think my understanding of Keynes, just based on my generation and when I was born, I understand Keynes as an incredibly gifted individual, but his philosophies may have been heavily influenced by the tragedy and hardship of his time. I kind of view it like that. I don't know nearly enough about Keynesian and Austrian economics to be able to talk about that with any authority. Interesting. So this guy compares it to kind of forest fires and how the government manages it. Famously, like out in California, if you had no human involvement, a forest fire might occur occasionally, and it would be just like a small fire that would clear most of the underbrush but leave most of the larger stuff intact. But ever since people began moving into more and more areas, they didn't allow any fires to happen. They had the view that all fires were bad because they could ultimately risk property and lives. So they started trying to extinguish every fire that came up. But then when there was a fire, it would be huge and it would be completely unmanageable and cause large loss of life and destruction. So now for forest management, they try to say they'll try to do controlled burns to remove some of that underbrush, and kind of manage the forestry by allowing these burns every so often. I think that's a very good analogy. You could consider a recession or a correction in the economy to be analogous to like one of these controlled burns. In a healthy economy, you might have a business cycle with growth and contraction. But if you try to smooth out all the bumps and just try to make it so that sonks always go up, that could have effects that may not have been properly considered. So I'm trying to. So Keynesians, on the other hand, believe that governments are an important market intermediary. And while its role is not properly defined, they believe that state intervention, pricing, and policy controls are essential tools to controlling, understanding, and predicting market conditions. Keynesians are adept at using models and modeling tools to make their predictions. So the Austrian School of Economics believes that the human and social element plays an equally important role in understanding prices, market movements, as well as money and value creation. Often dubbed as economic philosophers, these economists make most of their findings more theoretical than mathematical. So theirs is not a purely based on model predictions. That's kind of the crux of what I'm trying to describe today. This is basically a philosophy class for nerds. And again, I want to get back to the idea of wherever there's a lot of people arguing, I find that really interesting and I want to understand it better. And I think, I've never seen quite something. I mean, I have, but just for the sake of this, where people are, so passionate about, how they view this and how they view it one way or the other way, or maybe a mix of both. I'm of the opinion that both groups have a lot of valid things to consider, and they do a very good, job of critiquing each other in very interesting ways. Personally, I don't believe that a completely unmanaged economy is a great idea, but I also have questions about the management. Has it been effective and performed with, the long-term stability in mind? I'm kind of coming around to the opinion that the management may have been flawed and that the long-term stability was severely impacted by various, decisions that were made along the way. So, yeah. So this book by Henry Hazlitt, I'm probably going to start framing more or trying to get tidbits from both these books. But my process is going to be, I'm going to be reading this book by John Maynard Keynes, and chapter by chapter, kind of like a sports play-by-play, then I'll be jumping over to Mr. Hazlitt's book and looking at, what ideas are contested, what arguments are contested, the merits of those arguments, and the implications of that discrepancy of thought, and what those implications could mean for broader systems that rely upon this school of thinking. So that's kind of where I am today. That's what I wanted to share. I wanted to share mainly that I'm excited about these two books arriving in the mail. And I hope that's helpful to, yeah. So, alrighty. Ta-ta for now.